You're listening to Mountain Heartbeat with Joe and Rosa Hopkins, proclaiming the gospel through word and through song.
I think nobody knows what they're going to do in those moments of life or death, what seems to be life or death. You know, you fight, flight, or freeze.
Welcome to Mountain Heartbeat. I'm Joe Hopkins. This week, Rosa continues the interview that she started last week with Rebecca Bender. Rebecca is a pro-life speaker and author, and she started the Rebecca Bender Initiative, which helps train law enforcement and others to spot human trafficking and to help get women out of human trafficking. What you heard was an excerpt from last week's show when she was describing how she felt when she was forced into prostitution by a person she thought loved her.
So, yes, it's obvious that the people, and in this case, the man that was acting as your boyfriend, that they target people out. It's obvious that this is methodical. This is well thought out. And so it is unrealistic, I would say, for people to say, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do... When it's painfully obvious, at least even to me just sitting here listening to it, that, no, this man had a plan. He had a plan from the very beginning, and He laid a trap. That's obviously what you do when you're taking somebody to a dead end and you're beating them and pretending to have all this other agenda beforehand doing it. It's obvious that you're setting a trap for somebody. And so walk us through what happened after that. I mean, so now obviously these people are keeping your daughter for some time during the day, and so there's that vulnerability. You obviously don't want anything to happen to her. I'm assuming that you must have felt threatened by this man and possibly friends of his, but so what did this eventually become? What did it turn into for you?
Well, you know, I think the important thing for people to remember is that the United States federal definition of the crime of human trafficking is to use force, fraud, or coercion. And it's really easy for all of us to imagine force, right? To imagine the beatings, to imagine someone taking your child, to imagine the fear. But people forget about the fraud and the coercive tactics. And there's been many girls that I've worked with now in the life of human trafficking who their trafficker has never physically abused them, that he constantly used the fraudulent promise of like this last time or one more month or as soon as we get this done or that done. And they've used the coercive tactics of depriving sleep, sometimes even without the victim knowing that they've been deprived sleep. So what do I mean by that? Well, we've had traffickers come forward and say, when she went to sleep, I'd put my hand over her mouth so she couldn't breathe. Then when she'd wake up, I'd pretend to be asleep. He said, I do that over and over and over again throughout the night. So the next morning, she felt groggy, but she didn't know why. Then she was easier to control. So we've had traffickers actually make those kind of statements, or in a sense, we found those kind of statements written in articles where traffickers are teaching other men how to traffic other women. There's member sites and blogs and books out where traffickers try to teach each other and mentor each other. And it's unreal, I think, for people to wrap their minds around the fact that this isn't something that happens in a third world country, and it less than 5% of trafficking in America is kidnapping. The majority of trafficked persons in America have been lured away from their family and friends through fraud and coercion, and then if they don't comply, then force is used. But if they're compliant, oftentimes coercion and fraud is enough to keep a lot of victims trained. And then the whole issue of brainwashing, which I know seems sometimes like an old fashion, or it used to happen in the old days. You'd think people are smart enough now, but I mean, we still have radical religious and political groups. I mean, people drink the Kool-Aid in Waco. There's so many little tiny, what I could only describe as propaganda that continues to keep victims thinking that the end is near, and like a carrot dangling of like, as soon as I get my money back, then you'll be done doing this. And so you're like this hamster on the wheel hoping that it's almost over, until you start realizing this isn't getting over. And it's at that point that you start seeing victims trying to plan an escape.
How often would you say that those of us that are going around getting our groceries or going through the everyday motions of life, how often would you say that we unknowingly run into people who have been trafficked?
All the time. I mean, traffic victims walk amongst us every day and nobody notices. I just had one of the prayer directors that works for us, volunteers with us. She ran into a victim at a shopping mall recently, and if she didn't know what to look for, she would have just looked potentially like another young girl at a shopping mall. But she knew that she was dressed a little inappropriately, and she noticed a 40-year-old man with this young girl walking behind her just a couple feet. And she decided to stick around and kind of loiter. And within 30 minutes, he had her hand in hand coming out of Macy's with a whole bunch of bags. And it was obvious that either this man was the buyer or the seller and was trying to keep her quiet and buy her compliance. Oftentimes that happens when you see young girls that come from poverty or foster care. It's very easy for an older man to promise a family, to promise provision, and they think, well, I've been abused all my life anyway, might as well get something out of it. And it's a real lie of false empowerment that predators are using to influence and coerce young teenage girls, which we all know are influential anyway.
Right.
But the older men, they know what they're doing, and they target foster children on purpose. So it's, again, very calculated. And trafficking then looks really different just based on the community you live in. So it's important that we all start to recognize what it could look in a community that we all live in.
Oh my. And I will say, as far as the tactics they use them because they work, obviously. And as far as foster care, my husband and I had taken a foster child who was 11 years old. This was 6 years ago. And I don't know what the case was that happened with her as far as whether she was adopted. I don't know how it turned out. But I do know from dealing with other foster children that once they age out of the system, it is a very vulnerable position, that they can be left completely without any support structure. And then when they reach a certain point, I think it's 21, they don't have financial benefits either. They lose their medical insurance from the government and things like that, and they are just a horribly vulnerable group of the population. So yes, absolutely, I can see it's unfortunate that they would be targeted, but I definitely understand their vulnerability and all of that. And so you were talking about things that would basically tip a person off, and that would look different in different communities. But are there any general things that maybe a person might notice that would alert them that the person in front of them potentially is a person who is being trafficked?
There's definitely lots of red flags and warning signs that anybody can look for. And, you know, some of these may differ based on where you live, and some of them also may differ based on how involved you are in relationship with the victim, right? If it's, for example, my situation where I'm an 18-year-old girl off at college, what could my mom have noticed during that 6 months of what we call a grooming time? Traffickers use, they date the victim, and then they groom the victim, then they do what's called breaking and then turning out. And it's this 4 kind of step or phase, in a sense, that traffickers employ. But when we're talking about prevention, how do we stop children from being trafficked, or how do we help identify a trafficked person? Was there something during that 6 months that myself as an 18-year-old or even my parents could have noticed? And, you know, absolutely. Yes, there are. And on our website, RebeccaBender.org/human trafficking, we have our red flag brochures, Are You Dating a Trafficker? With almost 300,000 children in America at risk for exploitation, it's really important that, just like we used to talk about drunk driving or DARE or good touch, bad touch or bullying, we've got to start talking about the issue of human trafficking, because it's on the rise in our country, unfortunately. It's surpassed the sale of guns. It's second only to drugs, the largest social justice issue of our times. And so it's important to be informed and aware and talk to your kids. Some of those red flags that I could just off the top of my head say would be, if your child is dating somebody 5 years older or more is one red flag. Second red flag would be frequent visits out of town. Third red flag would be less and less communication with their family and friends. a slow, gradual kind of seclusion. It's not an abduction, right? It's a slow and gradual separation and wedge that trafficker begins dividing. Very expensive things, 2 cell phones, up all night and sleeps all day. Those are some of the warning signs that we have taught children or teenagers or girls off at college to look for in one another, to look for kind of with the person that they're dating. The guy that they're dating, some red flags would be no job that anyone can actually visit, right? He's a quote-unquote business person, but no office anywhere, no file cabinet anywhere, no website where there's an about page, and we see right, there's some great things with the internet is we can look into people a little bit now, and I would say if some of those warning signs are going off, to definitely use the internet to do some digging on the person that's involved in your child's life.
Absolutely. And so if, say that's the case, if you believe that there are some red flags, is there any danger to just breaking up with the person? I mean, is it sort of like those domestic violence scenarios where you do have to exercise a great deal of caution, or do they tend to be scared away when they feel threatened and they try to go for somebody easier? What kind of things can you do if you think that your child's being targeted by one of these people?
Well, it really depends on the point at which they're being targeted, right? If they're just barely starting to date somebody and everyone's seeing red flags, but, they've only been talking a couple weeks, absolutely do an intervention and say, no, this guy, no one can find him online, and, maybe talk to your child one-on-one and get involved in that way. If it's been several months and they're starting to get ready to move away, she's probably not going to listen to you. And the more you push, the more that they may push back because they don't believe yet. They're being brainwashed. That's that grooming component. And so they're not believing the lies you're saying about this person that they love. And so you might want to get police involved at that point. It would be dangerous to kind of try to intervene because then that wedge is being divided even sooner. And it's going to be an even larger division, if you're sounding the alarm, so to speak. You want to at least maintain communication so you know where they are and then get law enforcement involved. You can always call your local kind of human trafficking unit or the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And one other thing I would just add is I know we're talking a lot about female victims right now, but 2 things. Boys are not exempt, for one. Anywhere where there's a demand, and there is a demand for pedophilia, traffickers and predators will exploit that demand in order to make money. Bad guys will find any ways to make money, right? And if, unfortunately, child abuse exists and childhood sexual abuse exists, then bad guys will find a way to make money off of that. That's what bad guys do. They find a way to corrupt anything. But the other thing that I think is really important to remember for anyone who has sons that are listening is the number one buyer of sex in America are American men. Whether it's boys or girls that are being sold, the number one buyer is a Caucasian American male, ages 35 to 50, who have expendable income, and they book a child during work hours on average of 2 p.m. It's a recent study out by King County in Washington State. So what are we doing as parents to raise up a culture of young boys that aren't objectifying women, that aren't seeking out pornography and then porn with skin on when the addiction gets too far? And what are we doing with our young men that are raising up this kind of demand in our country? We're doing something wrong, parents, and we really need to look into how we're parenting our boys and how we're also warning our girls.
Thank you for joining us this week on Mountain Heartbeat. Please join us again next week when Rosa continues this interview with Rebecca Bender. Same channel, same time. And you can find Rosa at gutsychristianity.com.